The glass didn't shatter when it hit the floor. It simply cracked. A clean split down the middle, two halves lying on the marble, like something that had been waiting a long time to break. Nobody moved to pick it up. Nobody looked at it. Every person in the room was looking at Tessa. She was standing with her hands at her sides, her chin level, her expression the kind of controlled stillness that takes years to learn. The kind you develop when you have spent enough time in rooms where people are waiting for you to react. Her husband was still holding the position. His hand had been in when it connected with her face. The sound had been small. That was the part that stayed with the people who were there. Not loud, not dramatic, just a flat, precise crack that moved through the dinner conversation and stopped everything the way a single wrong note can stop an orchestra. The Hartwell family spring gathering had been running for 22 years, 84 guests, 3 generations of one of Ontario's oldest real estate dynasties, gathered at the Hartwell lakehouse in Muskoka, the kind of property that had its own name, its own Wikipedia entry, its own gravitational pull on people who had spent their lives orbiting wealth. The catering staff had arrived at 7 in the morning. The floral arrangements alone had cost $14,000. There was a federal member of parliament in attendance, seated 3 chairs to the left of where Tessa now stood. There was a provincial court judge. There were 2 sitting members of the Hartwell board of directors, 3 managing partners from Bay Street firms, and a woman who had been on the cover of Report on Business twice in 4 years. None of them said anything. Tessa had known it would be like this. She had known it, before she drove up the 400, before she turned onto the private road that cut through the birch trees, before she heard the gravel under the tires and thought, for a moment, about simply turning around. She had stayed in the car for 6 minutes before going inside. She had counted. She had been doing a lot of counting in those years. Counting the silences, counting the comments, counting the number of times she had been introduced at a Hartwell event and then watched someone's eyes move past her, through her, to whoever was standing behind her. The first time she met Garrett Hartwell's mother, Frances had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Well, Garrett always did have interesting taste." She had laughed. She had thought it was a joke. She had been 36 years old, and she had already built one company from a rented desk in a co-working space in Regent Park. And she had thought she was past the age of being surprised by anything. She had been wrong. The counting had started in the 2nd year. At the Hartwell Christmas dinner, when the family photograph was taken in front of the stone fireplace, she had been standing in the back row. And when the photographer had said, shift left," she had shifted left. And somehow, she could never reconstruct exactly how, she had ended up standing just outside the edge of the frame. The photograph had been framed and hung in the Muskoka lakehouse by February. She was not in it. Garrett had said he hadn't noticed. He had said this in the voice he used when he wanted her to understand that the conversation was over. In the 3rd year, at the Hartwell Foundation spring luncheon, a man she had never met had come up beside her while she was standing near the bar and handed her his empty glass. She had looked at him. He had looked at her. He had said, "Oh, sorry, I thought you were," and then trailed off in a way that made very clear what he had thought. She had set the glass down on a nearby surface and walked away, and Frances Hartwell, who had seen the entire exchange from across the room, had smiled at something her companion was saying and continued her conversation. By the 4th year, Tessa had stopped expecting anything different. She had simply learned to carry herself through these events the way you carry yourself through a medical appointment. Present, functional, waiting for it to be over. Garrett had said she was too sensitive. He had said this with the particular patience of someone who has decided that the most generous interpretation of their behavior is the correct one. He had said that his family was simply old-fashioned, that they took time to warm up, that if she would just make more of an effort, be warmer, be softer, be easier to be around, things would change. She had made the effort. She had spent 9 years making the effort. She had learned the names of all his cousins. She had remembered birthdays. She had brought the right wine to dinners, and the right hostess gifts to weekend gatherings. And she had sat through Francis's stories about the family cottage and Garrett's brother Malcolm's stories about his years at Upper Canada College and his wife Penelope's observations about the difficulty of finding good help, and she had smiled and nodded and contributed thoughtfully, and she had done all of this while running a company that now employed 340 people and had just completed its second round of Series B funding. Nobody at these events asked about her company. She had stopped being surprised by this in year 3. The remark that preceded the slap had been made by Malcolm. He had been standing at the head of the long table with a glass of Bordeaux and the comfortable authority of a man who has never in his life had to wonder whether he belonged in a room. He had been telling a story about a deal that had gone wrong, some acquisition that had fallen apart, and the punchline of the story was that the other party had gotten exactly what they deserved for trusting someone who had no business being at the table. He had looked at Tessa when he said it. It had not been subtle. It had not been meant to be subtle. Penelope had laughed. Francis had looked at her wine glass. The member of Parliament had cleared his throat and reached for the bread basket. Tessa had not looked away. She had held Malcolm's gaze until he looked down first, and she had felt the familiar tightening in her chest that she recognized as the specific exhaustion of being the only person in a room who is required to pretend that nothing just happened. Garrett had heard it. She had seen him hear it. She had watched his jaw tighten and then loosen, and she had watched him make the same decision he always made, to let it pass. Later, when the main course had been cleared and the conversations had separated into smaller tributaries, Tessa had leaned toward him and said, quietly, "I need you to say something to Malcolm." Garrett had looked at her for a moment with the expression she knew well, the one that meant she was making something out of nothing, that she was embarrassing him, that she didn't understand how these things worked. "You know how he is," Garrett said. "He's not going to change." "I'm not asking him to change," Tessa said. "I'm asking you to say something. Now is not the time." "When is the time, Garrett?" He had said her name the way he sometimes said her name, which was like closing a door. Tessa, she had gone still. She had looked at the centerpiece, white peonies, which she had always thought were Francis's way of communicating something, and she had taken a breath, and she had said, "I would like you to go on record, to your family, once, as someone who is on my side." What happened next happened quickly. Garrett turned to look at her, and his face had something in it that she had never quite seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something beneath anger, some older and less manageable feeling. And he said, low enough that only the 4 or 5 people nearest to them could hear, "You should be grateful I brought you into this family at all." She had looked at him. She had been many things in her life. She had been a girl growing up in Scarborough in a 2-bedroom apartment with her mother and her 2 brothers, all of them eating cereal for dinner sometimes, because that was what the month allowed. She had been a young woman who had worked 3 jobs while completing her computer science degree, who had slept on her cousin's couch for 8 months while she built her first prototype, who had been told, in a pitch meeting in 2014, by a VC who had not bothered to look up from his phone, that her idea was too niche and her market analysis was frankly naive. She had built the company anyway. She had been through a lot of things, but she had never, in all of it, been told that she should be grateful. She said, "What did you say?" And Garrett Hartwell, in front of a federal MP, a provincial court judge, 2 Bay Street managing partners, and 67 other people who had known his family for decades, raised his hand and brought it across her face. The room went silent in the specific way that rooms go silent when something has happened that everyone will spend years pretending was more ambiguous than it was. Tessa stood very still. The broken glass was on the floor. Someone had knocked it over in the startled movement that had rippled through the nearest cluster of guests, and it lay there, split clean in 2, and nobody moved toward it. She looked around the table. She looked at Malcolm, who had gone pale in the way people go pale when they realize that events have moved beyond what they can manage with a story. She looked at Francis, who was looking at her hands. She looked at Penelope, who was looking at the window. She looked at the member of parliament, who was looking at the tablecloth. She looked at Garrett. His hand was still raised. His face had gone through several things in rapid succession, and had arrived at something that might have been shock at himself. But she could not be sure, and she found that she did not particularly care. She picked up her napkin from her lap. She set it on the table beside her plate with the same precision she brought to everything. She stood up, and she was very careful about how she stood up. Unhurried, spine straight, the way her mother had told her once to always stand up when she was leaving a room, because the way you leave a room is the last thing people remember. She walked out. Her footsteps on the marble entrance hall were the only sound in the building. She sat in her car for a moment in the dark. The birch trees stood at the edge of the driveway, pale and thin, catching the light from the lakehouse windows. She could hear the lake somewhere in the distance, that low, continuous sound it makes at night, indifferent to everything. She started the car. She did not cry on the drive back. She drove south on the 400 with the radio off and the windows up and thought about very specific, practical things. The meeting she had at 9 on Monday morning. The engineering team's sprint review that she had been looking forward to. The call she needed to make to her lawyer. She thought about her apartment in the distillery district and her very old cat, who was probably sitting on the radiator. She thought about calling her mother. But it was late, and her mother would know from her voice, and she wasn't ready for her mother to know yet. She drove. She had been driving for 40 minutes when her phone lit up on the console. She didn't look at it. It lit up again, and then it started ringing, and she glanced at the screen and saw that it was not Garrett, not her lawyer, not her assistant, but a number she didn't recognize, and then another, and then her assistant's number 3 times in a row. She pulled over at the next rest stop. She had 17 missed calls. She sat in the parking lot and opened her texts, and the first one was from her assistant Priscilla, sent 40 minutes ago. Tessa, are you watching the news? The second was from her co-founder, Marcus Nyarko, 8 minutes after that. Are you okay? CBC just ran something. Call me. The third was from her board chair, sent 12 minutes ago. Tessa, please call me as soon as you see this. She opened the CBC app. The segment was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. It had aired at 10:17 p.m. on a Friday night, and had, by the time Tessa was reading the notification, already been viewed 600,000 times. It was a profile piece, something that had been in production for 2 months, something her communications team had coordinated, something she had filmed interviews for in March. A segment on women in Canadian tech. A segment on founders who had built something out of nothing. Her face was on the screen, her company's name, her story, Scarborough, the couch, the pitch meetings, the 340 employees, her actual name, her actual title, Tessa Okafor, founder and CEO, Meridian Systems. There was a secondary headline running along the bottom of the segment, added in real time by the production team. Because the production team had, like everyone else, been watching social media in the last hour. Subject of tonight's profile, reported to be involved in domestic incident at Muskoka event. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time. What she felt was not what she would have expected to feel. It was not satisfaction. It was not relief. It was something quieter than either of those things, something more like the particular stillness that comes when something you have been carrying for a very long time is finally and irrevocably set down. She called Marcus back. He answered on the first ring. "I'm okay," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Good. That's the main thing. Tell me what's happening," he told her. The segment had aired. Someone at the Hartwell event, she never found out who, had posted on social media within minutes of her leaving. A grainy video, shot from across the table, 23 seconds long. It was not definitive. You could see the movement. You could see the reaction. You could not see the expression on Garrett's face. But combined with the CBC segment, combined with the timestamps, combined with the fact that Garrett Hartwell was someone people in certain circles knew, it had been enough. The comments section of the CBC segment had 3,000 comments by midnight. By the next morning, there were 412 media requests in Tessa's company inbox. Garrett's lawyer called at 7 a.m. His tone was that of a man who has spent the night recalibrating and has arrived at a position. He used the word context 6 times. Tessa's lawyer responded at 9 a.m. She used the word domication twice, and then she used some other words that were more specific, and then the call was over. The police had been called the previous night, not by anyone from the Hartwell family. None of them had moved. But by one of the catering staff, a young woman named Deborah, who had been clearing glasses from the far end of the table, and who, unlike every person with a law degree or a parliamentary seat in that room, picked up her phone and called 911. Garrett was formally charged 3 days later. Malcolm issued a statement through the family's communications firm that was 4 paragraphs long and said nothing at all. Francis did not issue a statement. Penelope deactivated her social media accounts. The Member of Parliament, in a scrum outside the House of Commons the following week, said that he had not witnessed anything directly and that he certainly hoped all parties would find a path forward. The provincial court judge said nothing publicly. He recused himself from an unrelated file that week. People made their own inferences. The video of Deborah, the catering worker, speaking to a CBC journalist outside her apartment building in Brampton, was viewed 1.2 million times. She had said, simply, "I wasn't going to just stand there. I don't understand why anyone would." She had been asked if she was worried about the professional consequences of her involvement, and she had looked at the journalist with the directness of someone who has not spent time in rooms where the professional consequences of doing the right thing are considered a legitimate counter-argument. And she had said, "For what? For calling the police when someone got hit in front of me?" Tessa watched that clip 4 times. She sent Deborah a note through her company's foundation. She kept it short. She said thank you, and she said she didn't know if that was enough, and she said she would like to find a way to make it more than that, if Deborah would allow it. Deborah wrote back 2 days later, 2 sentences. "You don't owe me anything. But yes." Meridian Systems' third-quarter earnings report was released 6 weeks after the Muskoka dinner. The company had grown 34% year over year. The engineering team's sprint had gone well. The 9 a.m. Monday meeting had resulted in a product decision that Tessa had been pushing for 18 months, and that 2 members of the board had finally, grudgingly, agreed was right. She moved back into the distillery apartment. The cat was on the radiator. She made herself tea and sat by the window and looked at the city, all of it lit up and ongoing, indifferent to her, in the particular way that cities are indifferent to everyone, which she had always found comforting rather than lonely. She thought about the 9 years. She thought about the photographs she was not in, and the glasses she had been handed, and the comments about her hair, and the story Malcolm had told about someone who had no business being at the table, and the 67 people who had watched what happened and looked at the tablecloth. She thought about Deborah, who had not looked at the tablecloth. She thought about her mother, who had worked double shifts at a hospital in Scarborough for 11 years, and who had told her, once, when she was very young and had come home from school, upset about something, she could no longer remember. You don't have to make yourself smaller so that other people are more comfortable. You were not built to be comfortable for anyone. She hadn't understood it then. She had understood it slowly, the way you understand most things that are actually true. Not all at once, but in pieces, over time, each piece arriving when you were ready to hold it. She finished her tea. She opened her laptop. She had work to do.